The battlefield is an unforgiving place, where danger lurks in the shadows, and every decision can mean the difference between life and death. But on one fateful mission, it wasn't a soldier who made the ultimate sacrifice. It was a dog. Leica, a fierce and loyal military K9, had served with unwavering dedication alongside her handler, Sergeant Julian MacDonald. She had trained for moments like this, but no training could have prepared her handler for what was about to unfold. When the ambush came, there was no time to think, only to act. Leica did what she was born to do, throwing herself into harm's way to shield her team from the threat. Bullets tore through the air, and in an instant, the mission became something far greater. A story of courage, sacrifice, and the kind of loyalty that defies all odds. But what happened in Leica's final moments left even the toughest soldiers in tears. Because some heroes wear uniforms, and others walk on four legs, leaving behind a legacy that will never be forgotten.
The Montana morning air bit sharply as U.S. Army Sergeant Julian Trent MacDonald stepped onto his front porch, steaming coffee mug in hand. His eyes automatically scanned the horizon, an old habit from his military days that he'd never quite shaken. The sun was just beginning to paint the sky in hues of pink and gold, casting long shadows across his modestly sized ranch. But his gaze wasn't focused on the breathtaking landscape. Instead, it was fixed on the three-legged German shepherd carefully making her way down the wooden ramp he'd built specially for her. Leica moved with a grace that seemed to defy her disability. At 13 years old, she'd slowed considerably, but her eyes still held that same sharp intelligence that had saved his life and the lives of his entire team that fateful day in Afghanistan. The memory of that mission still visited him in his dreams, though 11 years had passed. "Come here, girl," Julian called softly, patting his thigh. Leica's ears perked up, and she navigated the ramp with practiced ease, her remaining three legs working in perfect coordination. As she reached his side, he knelt down, running his hands through her graying fur. "That's my good girl," he whispered, his throat tightening as he noticed how much thinner she felt beneath his fingers. The last few months had been hard. The veteran K9 handler had watched helplessly as age began to catch up with his loyal partner. The same dog who had once taken 4 bullets to protect him now needed help getting up sometimes, and her once voracious appetite had diminished to gentle nibbling. But her spirit, that incredible, unbreakable spirit, remained as strong as ever. As Julian sipped his coffee, his mind drifted back to 2013, when he'd first met Leica at the Military Working Dog Training Center at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas. He remembered standing in line with other handlers, waiting to be paired with their new partners. The trainer had approached with a young, energetic German shepherd straining at her leash, eyes bright with intelligence and determination. "This is Leica," the trainer had said, 2 years old, top of her class in detection and protection work. "She's got something special about her, Sergeant MacDonald. I think you two will make a good team." Those words had proved prophetic in ways none of them could have imagined. Over the next several months, Julian and Leica had trained together, forming a bond that went far beyond the typical handler-dog relationship. They learned to read each other's subtle cues, to anticipate each other's movements, to trust each other implicitly. That trust would ultimately save both their lives. A cold nose nudging his hand brought Julian back to the present. Leica was looking up at him with those knowing eyes, as if she could sense the weight of his memories. He smiled, scratching behind her ears just the way she liked. "Let's go inside, girl. Sarah will be up soon, and you know how she likes to make your special breakfast." Sarah, Julian's wife of 8 years, had been Leica's strongest advocate after the incident in Afghanistan. When Julian had fought to adopt Leica following her medical retirement, Sarah had written letters, made phone calls, and refused to take no for an answer. She'd even reached out to her congressman, arguing that the dog who had saved her future husband's life deserved to come home to them. Inside their warm kitchen, Julian could hear Sarah moving around upstairs. Their teenage daughter, Emma, had inherited her mother's early rising habits, and soon the house would be filled with the comfortable sounds of their morning routine. But for now, it was just him and Leica, sharing the quiet moments before dawn as they had done countless times before. As Julian prepared Leica's medication, hidden in small pieces of cheese, a trick they discovered worked best, his mind wandered back to that day in Afghanistan that had changed everything. The mission had seemed straightforward enough: secure a compound suspected of housing high-value targets. Their team had done similar operations dozens of times before, but something about this one had felt different from the start. The compound had been eerily quiet when they'd arrived. The initial sweep had suggested the area was clear, but Julian had learned to trust Leica's instincts above all else. When she'd indicated there might be something worth investigating in one of the inner rooms, he'd listened. What he hadn't expected was for everything to go sideways so quickly. The memory played out in vivid detail. Leica moving ahead to check the room, her body language suddenly tensing. The split second when Julian realized something was wrong. The flash of movement in the shadows. The deafening sound of automatic weapon fire. And then Leica, his brave, loyal Leica, launching herself toward the threat without hesitation. The firefight had lasted only seconds, but those seconds had stretched into an eternity. For bullets had torn through Leica's body, but she hadn't backed down. Despite her injuries, she'd managed to keep the insurgent occupied long enough for the team to neutralize the threat. It wasn't until after the dust had settled that Julian had seen the full extent of her injuries. The memory of cradling her bloody body as they rushed to the medical evacuation point still haunted him. The veterinary team had worked miracles that day, but they couldn't save her right front leg. The damage had been too severe. Many had thought she would need to be euthanized, but Leica had other plans. Her determination to live, to recover, to adapt had amazed everyone involved in her care. "Dad?" Emma's voice pulled Julian from his reverie. His 16-year-old daughter stood in the kitchen doorway, already dressed for school, her long brown hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. "Is Leica okay? She seems extra tired this morning." Julian looked down at his faithful companion, who had settled herself near his feet. She did seem more subdued than usual, but she lifted her head and wagged her tail at the sight of Emma. "She's just taking it easy this morning, sweetheart," Julian replied, though a knot of worry formed in his stomach. "You know how the cold weather affects her joints." Emma crossed the kitchen and knelt beside Leica, gently stroking her fur. The teenager had grown up with stories of Leica's heroism, and the bond between them was special. When Emma had been younger, she'd often sat with Leica for hours, reading her books or telling her secrets. The aging canine had been infinitely patient, seeming to understand her role as confidant and protector of this young human who had become part of her family. "Remember when I was little," Emma said, "and I used to pretend Leica was my guard dog at school? I'd tell all my friends about how she saved you and your whole team. Nobody believed me until you came for career day and brought her with you." Julian smiled at the memory. Leica had been a hit with Emma's third-grade class, demonstrating some of her basic training commands and soaking up attention from the children. Even with only 3 legs, she'd moved with such dignity and confidence that the students had been in awe. Sarah joined them in the kitchen, immediately noticing the thoughtful mood that had settled over her family. She moved to the cabinet where they kept Leica's special food, a prescription diet supplemented with joint supplements and other medications to keep her comfortable in her senior years. "How about some breakfast, sweet girl?" Sarah asked, and Leica's tail thumped against the floor in response. Despite her decreased appetite, she never refused food from Sarah's hand. As they went about their morning routine, Julian couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about today. Maybe it was the way Leica seemed to be watching them all more intently than usual, or how she stayed closer to his side instead of making her usual morning patrol of the house. After 11 years together, he'd learned to trust his instincts when it came to his partner. The day progressed normally enough. Emma left for school, Sarah headed to her job at the local veterinary clinic, and Julian settled in to work on the book he'd been writing about military working dogs. Leica remained by his desk, occasionally sighing contentedly or shifting positions to stay comfortable. It was mid-afternoon when Julian noticed the change. Leica had gotten up with difficulty and moved to the window, staring out at something only she could see. When he called to her, she turned to look at him with an expression that made his heart skip a beat. There was something in her eyes, a knowledge, acceptance, that he'd seen before in other dogs near the end of their journey. "No," he whispered, kneeling beside her. "Not yet, girl. Please, not yet." But Leica had always had her own way of doing things, and it seemed she had made up her mind about this too. Julian called Sarah at work, trying to keep his voice steady as he explained what he was seeing. She understood immediately, promising to come home right away and to bring Dr. Anderson, the veterinarian who had been caring for Leica since their move to Montana. The next hour was both precious and painful. Julian sat on the floor with Leica's head in his lap, talking to her softly about their years together. He told her about the lives she'd saved, the difference she'd made, and how much she was loved. She listened with those wise eyes fixed on his face, occasionally lifting her head to lick away the tears he couldn't hold back. Sarah arrived with Dr. Anderson just as Emma was getting home from school. One look at the scene in the living room told them everything they needed to know. Emma dropped her backpack and rushed to Leica's side, while Sarah knelt beside Julian, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. Dr. Anderson's examination confirmed what they already knew in their hearts. Leica's body was shutting down, and while they could try aggressive medical intervention, it would only prolong the inevitable and cause her unnecessary suffering. "She's telling us it's time," Sarah said softly, voicing what none of them wanted to admit. Julian nodded, unable to speak. He'd faced death before, had lost friends in combat, but somehow this felt different. Leica wasn't just his partner or his pet. She was a piece of his soul, a living reminder that even in the darkest moments, loyalty and love could prevail. Word spread quickly through the veteran community in their small town. Within an hour, several former handlers and their K9s had gathered outside the McDonald home to pay their respects. They formed an honor guard along the driveway, understanding the significance of this moment, not just for Julian and his family, but for all who served alongside these extraordinary animals. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the living room floor, Dr. Anderson prepared everything they would need. Julian held Leica close, memorizing every detail of her face, her scent, the feel of her fur beneath his fingers. "You've done your duty, girl," he whispered. "You can rest now. We'll be okay." Emma pressed her face into Leica's fur, her tears falling silently. Sarah kept one hand on Julian's shoulder and the other stroking Leica's back, providing comfort to both her husband and the dog who had brought them together. With gentle efficiency, Dr. Anderson administered the medication that would ease Leica's passage. The brave K9 who had faced gunfire without flinching now closed her eyes peacefully, surrounded by the family who loved her. Her last breath was as quiet as a whisper, but to Julian, it echoed like thunder. Outside, the K9 handlers and their dogs stood at attention. One by one, the dogs raised their voices in a final salute to their fallen comrade, their howls carrying across the Montana evening like a warrior's farewell. In the days that followed, condolences poured in from around the country. The story of Leica's sacrifice and her years of service had touched countless lives. The National Geographic article that had featured her had brought attention to the vital role of military working dogs and the need for better post-service care. Her legacy had already helped change policies, and improve conditions for other retired military dogs. A week after Leica's passing, Julian stood in his workshop, carefully sanding the edges of a wooden plaque. Emma had suggested creating a memorial, and the project had given them all something to focus on through their grief. The plaque would hold Leica's medals, her service photos, and a simple inscription that read, Leica, 2011 to 2024. Partner, protector, friend, greater love hath no one than this, that they lay down their life for their friends. John 15 verse 13-inch. As he worked, Julian reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From the battlefields of Afghanistan to the peaceful mountains of Montana, Leica had been his constant companion, his guardian angel, his living reminder that courage comes in many forms. The front door opened, and Sarah called out to him. "They're ready, honey. Emma's waiting in the car." Today they would drive to the newly established military working dog memorial at Fort Harrison, where a statue of Leica would stand alongside other K-9 heroes. The ceremony would be attended by military personnel, veterans, and civilians who understood the extraordinary bond between handlers and their dogs. As Julian gathered his tools, his eyes fell on a photograph pinned to his workshop wall. It showed him and Leica in Afghanistan, both younger, both focused on their mission. Below it was a more recent picture. Leica playing with Emma in the backyard, her three-legged gait as graceful as ever, her spirit undimmed by age or injury. "You changed more than just my life, girl," he whispered to the photos. "You showed us all what it means to be truly brave." Outside, the Montana spring had painted the landscape in vibrant greens and wildflower colors. As Julian joined his family in the car, he caught sight of something moving at the edge of their property. A German shepherd, strong and proud, running with fluid grace across the meadow. He blinked, and the image was gone, but the message remained. Leica's physical presence might have left them, but her spirit, that incredible combination of courage, loyalty, and love, would live on in every military working dog who followed in her pawprints, in every handler who learned her story, and in the hearts of the family who had been privileged to share her final years. As they drove toward Fort Harrison, Julian reached for Sarah's hand, drawing strength from her presence. In the back seat, Emma held the wooden plaque on her lap, her fingers tracing the words they had chosen together. The morning sun caught the medals mounted on the plaque, making them gleam like stars. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, the sound carrying clearly through the crisp mountain air. Julian smiled, remembering Leica's own distinctive bark, authoritative yet somehow joyful, always ready for the next mission, the next adventure, the next opportunity to prove that sometimes the greatest heroes walk on four legs. Or in Leica's case, 3 legs and an indomitable spirit that would inspire generations to come.